cannonball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
And so, the reason they didn't do it, in my opinion, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, is they knew they were not going to go there. They knew it was going to be faked, because they knew how difficult it was. They discovered a lot of the problems. Certainly with the command module on Apollo 1, the Apollo 1 fire in January 1967, and they had to redesign the whole command module. The whole concept of Apollo was changed.
Yeah.
And at that point, somebody might have said, hey, are we really going to be able to achieve President Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade, i.e. 1969, and return him safely to Earth? Getting him to the moon really wasn't a problem, because that had been done with unmanned craft. The Russians had done it several times. Americans had sent unmanned craft, the Surveyor craft, the Ranger craft, the Lunar Orbiter craft. They had been sent to the moon, so they could get to the moon, but not one of those ever came back to Earth. The first time it ever happened was with the Soviet Union on Zond 5. They orbited the moon, September 1968, they orbited the moon and returned to Earth, landed in the Indian Ocean. There are pictures of it. The first time it had ever happened that a craft had returned from lunar orbit. But they didn't know they could do it. And yet, 3 months after that, America are launching Apollo 8 with humans on board to orbit the moon and return to Earth. Yeah, they may have returned to Earth, but they don't see the evidence that they orbited the moon.
Yep.
And anybody who can prove me wrong, please say so. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who will claim, well, NASA says they did it, therefore they did. No, that's not evidence. That's hearsay.
Well, I definitely cannot disagree with you on anything you've said right now. You're absolutely right. And I haven't seen anyone else come back and try to counter anything you have said. I've been on this for the last 2 to 3 years, writing my books and watching the videos and reading the comments, and I've never seen anybody come back with any counter response. Marcus, that leads me into something in terms of your work here. I was I watched your previous radio, listened to your previous radio interview, and you talked a lot on there about your work with Robert Williams and Scott Henderson. And before we touch on that, I just want to give a shout out to Robert for the video work that he's doing. He makes my videos look like I'm a famous producer in Hollywood. I mean, it just does. I don't know where he gets this skill, but I haven't seen anyone with the skill he has, the level of skill he has when it comes to editing and producing videos. And he really helps to get the message out. And I love watching my own videos. Oh, well, I don't like watching my own videos. I like watching my own videos when he adds in the editing and producing.
Exactly.
Then it's actually worth watching.
Oh yeah. It makes a big difference. And it's because Robert has a lifetime's experience of video editing and combining sound with pictures. He's done a fantastic job. So big shout out to Robert and to Scott, who provides a lot of the background information. He's Googling away, getting the 1 or 2 pictures that are going to make a difference to the film. So those two and yourself have done a great job in bringing to the attention of the world, because I get emails from people all over the world saying, oh, I saw one of your videos recently, and I agree with what you say, or I disagree with what you say. I think you're a liar, one of them says. I think, well, okay, tell me how I did it. What was I lying about?
Exactly.
Do I ever get a reply? No, I don't, because there's a sort of one hit mission. They think they're going to upset you by coming along and saying, oh, you're a liar, or you're this, or you're that, or you don't know what you're talking about. They're the NASA supporters, or as I now call them, the NASA parrots, because they just parrot what NASA tell them to say.
Exactly. And I just saw, I didn't do it actually. Robert did. He just produced the first segment. I think he's on the second segment now of my part 1 and part 2 of my new book. And he really, like, when I was looking at the video, we were looking at it the other night, and I couldn't believe the archival footage he got for the videos that he does. And this, like, actually, this was in regards to Jack Parsons. He was getting information. I don't know where he gets these videos, but it's absolutely amazing. But it's interesting that you were saying emails from around the world. I get them occasionally too, but I never get, and I don't think you do either, we never get any challenging emails in terms of, well, okay, Marcus or Randy, you said this. What about this? It's you said this, and you're an idiot. Yeah, that's the response we get.
Yeah.
They never back it up with anything of their own. Fine. You know what? As you say yourself, Marcus, if I'm wrong, prove me wrong.
Yeah, prove me wrong.
Yeah. And that leads me into your work with Robert Williams and Scott Henderson in terms of the work that the three of you have done. I'd really like you to talk about that, your work in regarding the vacuum film in a vacuum space, because that is, for me, that just solidifies the whole Apollo record, the photo and film record, either being faked or in the studio. That just takes that right off the file. So I'd like you to talk about that.
Yeah, 1 minute. I just want to get something. Because if we're going to talk about film in space, which we are, we need to know what it looks like. Photographic film is what we're talking about. Because Apollo used photographic film cameras. Hasselblad cameras, brilliant cameras, very good cameras, no problem with that. But they used photographic film inside the camera because, guess what? Digital cameras hadn't been invented by then. They were in 1975 when digital cameras were first invented. Video cameras, on the other hand, are digital, and they were used on Apollo. But what I'm talking about here are the still photographs taken on the lunar surface by the named astronauts using the Hasselblad cameras. And we all know what the Hasselblad camera looks like. I've handled a replica of the Apollo cameras. They're very good cameras. You have to know one thing about those cameras. They have no viewfinder, and they're mounted on the astronaut's chest. We've seen pictures of it, so it's not in dispute. So they have to move their body to point the camera. All right, you can take the camera off and you can use it, but you still haven't got a viewfinder. So how do you work out what you're going to photograph? And there's a couple of photographs taken on Apollo 11 of the Earth, picture of the Earth. Now, think about it for a minute. If you're standing on Earth and looking at the moon, what you see is the full face of the moon. If it's a full moon, you see the full face of the moon. So if you're standing on the moon, where would you look if you're on basically the equator of the moon? Where would you look to see Earth? You would look more or less overhead.
Yeah. Yep.
Now that's quite high. If you've got a camera on your chest,
you'd be looking up like this.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you've got a camera on your chest, how do you know you've got the Earth in the camera? You don't, because you've got a viewfinder. So what you do, any photographer will tell you this, if you haven't got a viewfinder, you take lots and lots and lots and lots of pictures, adjusting it very slightly, and you hope that one of them is going to be what you want. In this case, showing Earth. They took 2 pictures. That's all, 2 pictures. But in order to take those pictures of Earth, they had to be leaning so far back, because Earth would be at least 60 degrees above them, leaning so far back, they'd probably tip over. It's a fake photograph. And if anybody can show it isn't a fake photograph, come on, let's hear about it. You NASA supporters, you groupies, you parrots, come on, let's hear about it. I'm saying that photograph is faked. Prove me wrong. Anyway, so they got these photographs, and there are some on Apollo 17 which do the same thing, but they got even cleverer then. They had Apollo 17 photographs of the Earth and the flag and the other astronaut in the same picture Wow, how did they do that? And even more impressive, the flag is pointing at the Earth. How did they know they were pointing at the Earth? It's just so laughable that they think we're going to accept this as reality, when all you've got to do is a bit of logical thinking, critical analysis, and you can show that the whole thing is complete fabrication, which the whole moon landing thing was. It was a fabrication for political purposes. And also because Kennedy, who had issued the initial challenge to land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth, had been killed. So he was martyred. His promise had to be maintained. In order to do it, they cut corners, they made mistakes, and now 50 years later, they can't even go back to the moon. They haven't got a rocket that's been tested yet, let alone launched. The SLS, the slow, late, and expensive rocket that they keep wittering on about how powerful it is. Doesn't matter how powerful it is, get it off the ground, guys. Show it can work. They haven't done that yet. And you mentioned Jack Parsons. Of course, the SLS rocket uses solid fuel boosters, the two white tubes on the side, solid fuel boosters. That was based on the work of Jack Parsons, who developed solid fuel. He worked out how to create the solid fuel and then ignite it so it would burn sensibly and it wouldn't explode. He was a brilliant man.
He's a brilliant man, and just a side note on that before we get back to the film, because I really want to talk about the vacuum aspect of how it was used in space. Jack Parsons was not only brilliant, but he had no formal education. He had no higher education than high school. He had no ability for calculus. Now, he wasn't a slouch either. He was pretty good when it came to algebraic equations, but he had no ability to do calculus. Yet he came out with theories that decades ago that are still used to this day. As you just mentioned, the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle. It was his mind that came up with a solution that they have been. A lot of people don't know this, but solid rockets actually go back several hundred years.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, and they always had a problem with instability in the mixture. And he just, I don't know how he did it. I wrote about it in the book, but a fluke one day, he came out and he just happened to see some construction crew laying down tar on a road. And it just, a light bulb went off, and he realized that using that mixture, and I won't go into details about it right now, it's in the book, but using that mixture would bring more stability to these solid fuel rockets. And he didn't have the mathematical know-how, but he knew exactly what he wanted. So basically what he did was he instructed people at Caltech, of all places,
Yes.
the mathematicians and physicists at Caltech, to come up with the solution, and they did. And even Caltech, and I quoted one in the book, a scientist said he basically knew what he wanted, and we were there to accommodate his theories, and we did.
Yeah.
That was the kind of mind that Jack Parsons had. And I might add that Jack Parsons literally, and I mean literally, not figuratively, literally walked in off the streets to Caltech and ended up getting his own lab. And this is a man without any higher education. He has no university, right? Yeah. So his theories are used to this day. There's a lot about Jack Parsons, and we could talk for quite a bit about Jack Parsons, and I hope it's a subject that maybe we can talk about in our next call. But I just wanted to bring that to the viewers, because I certainly want to get back to the vacuum, because I think that is a fascinating subject, because I did mention it in the appendix. I put something in the appendix of my new book about it, your work with Robert Williams and Scott Henderson. And the work that the three of you have done is absolutely amazing, because there doesn't seem any room for argument anymore. People will analyze the photos, and they can point out this in the photos and say, here's an anomaly.
Yeah.
But then when you figure out how it was done according to the official version, and the technology at the time, and the cameras that were used, as you just mentioned, and the film that was used in the camera, and the experiments that you, Robert, and Scott had done in terms of how we would be effective or not effective in the vacuum of space is really something I'd like you to talk about.
Okay. We're talking about this photographic film, just so that we're absolutely precise about it. Now, here's the question. Can photographic film work in a vacuum? And I'm talking about the vacuum of space. Does it work? The answer is no, it doesn't. So how do we know this? How do we know that film does not work in the vacuum of space? Until 2018, I didn't know anything about the vacuum of space affecting photographic film until I attended a lecture given at the British Interplanetary Society, of which I'm a member, by a gentleman with the name of Phil Pressel, who was the designer and developer of the camera equipment used on the Hexagon reconnaissance satellite, or spy satellite, more likely. He was very proud of what he'd done. It was a stereo camera. There were two cameras working in conjunction, because what it was intended to do was to overfly Russia on a polar orbit, photographing whatever sights it came across. And by having a stereo camera, photo analysis of the pictures after they'd been returned to Earth they would be able to calculate the size of the rocket, the length of a battleship in port, and various other calculations required for national security in America to determine if the Soviets were ahead of America in terms of space. This is 1970, the first Hexagon spy satellite was launched. And during the talk, Phil Pressel is a charming man, lovely man. He'd retired. Obviously, he'd been working at Elmer Perkins. That was the company that produced the camera equipment in Northeast America. I forget exactly where it is. It doesn't really matter. But he was very proud of what he'd done. And he was describing it and pointing out features on the camera and how the film was carried across from the 30 miles of film that was on the spools on which the camera was using the film, 6-inch wide film. So there's quite a lot of film on board. And he said, almost in passing, as if everybody knew about it, well, of course, we had to keep the film pressurized because film doesn't work in a vacuum. I thought, what? I've never heard this. Nobody's ever mentioned this before. And the reason it's never been mentioned before is because the Hexagon spy satellite and its workings were classified. Obviously, it was a spy satellite. America were not going to tell everybody how they worked. It was classified until 2011, when it was declassified. And this was 2018. I was hearing Phil Pressel describing it. He was now released from his secrecy oaths, and he could talk about it. And he's very proud of what he'd done. But he made that one comment. Of course, we had to keep the film under a small amount of pressure, and he showed all the tubes in which the film was carried from the spools through the camera to the buckets that dropped the film when it was exposed back down, caught by aircraft as it landed. It's an extraordinary system, quite real. I mean, you can check it out. It's such a strange way of doing it. But anyway, he made this comment, and I thought, sort of bulb went off in my head at that point. I thought, hang on a minute, film cannot work in a vacuum. This stuff can't work in a vacuum. And this is from a person who would obviously know about it because he'd worked on the camera equipment. He showed us all the tubes that film had to go through. So when the talk was over and question time, I asked him, I said, would the same restrictions apply to Apollo? Of course they would, he said. Film doesn't work in a vacuum. End of story. Apollo is fake.
Yeah. Because
the photographs could not have been taken on the lunar surface with the cameras, the Hasselblad cameras that we've seen in many of the pictures, because the film inside those cameras, film inside the camera would not record the images. Now, you mentioned Robert and Scott, who helped on this. when I mentioned this, I told Scott about it originally. Scott then relayed the information to Robert. They live in different parts of Canada. So Robert decided, right, we'll go and buy a vacuum chamber and test this idea, see if it has validity. So he bought a vacuum chamber, not a very big one, because commercial vacuum chambers can be quite expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And he tested it and found that by drawing a vacuum in the chamber, you can test the vacuum is there by putting a bowl of water inside the chamber, reduce or increase the vacuum, and eventually the water will start to boil. That's called outgassing. It's one of the effects of a vacuum, outgassing. It wasn't producing a very high vacuum, so they bought another motor to attach to the vacuum chamber, which produced a slightly higher vacuum, not much higher, because it's very difficult to produce it. It takes several hours to evacuate the air. There's quite a lot of air at sea level. So you've got to pump all this out. All these molecules have got to be coming out. And sure enough, they put a film into it, into the vacuum chamber, pumped the air out. About 8 hours, because that is the length of time that Apollo 17 were conducting their EVAs, 8 hours on the lunar surface. Could a film survive an 8-hour vacuum test? So they did the 8 hours, released the vacuum, took the film out of the vacuum chamber, put it into a camera, used it to take photographs, and sure enough, even at a relatively low level of vacuum, the color balance of the film was completely shot. Blues weren't blue, reds weren't red, greens weren't green. And the film, even the black and white film, was starting to show misty, as if it was in radiation, because that's the effect you get, where you get the film starts to reduce the contrast. That's what fogging is. So they demonstrated it and published their result. We published the result on Aulis, the Aulis website, aulis.com. But also Robert has done several films of the work he did and how he did it and what he did and the care he took over ensuring that everything was done by the book in terms of developing the film. He even went out and bought the S-star-based film. S-star means polyester-based film. That's the plastic backing onto which the emulsion, the light-sensitive emulsion, is coated. And it's the light-sensitive emulsion which outgasses, because it started life as a liquid. It's dried when it's on the film, or your camera will get a bit mucky. If the emulsion outgasses, that means that the lighter elements contained in hydrogen, helium, the lighter elements outgas, i.e. are ripped out by the vacuum, or rather they can't stay in because there's nothing to hold them in, so they drift out. The film is shot. We've demonstrated this.
Well, I just want to ask you, if you don't mind backing up a little bit, because you mentioned, I want the viewers to really understand this point. You mentioned that with the vacuum, you're only able to simulate to a certain altitude above Earth. So first of all, it's a two-part question. First of all, what was the altitude, approximate altitude, that is, that you, Robert, and Scott were able to simulate? And then talk about that altitude versus what the actual conditions on the lunar surface would be like. Because if they were only able to, if you're only able to test, let's say, up to 100 kilometers or 150 miles altitude, and you still got some images, but very distorted images, what would that be like with the vacuum on the lunar surface? So I guess the second question would be, what is the difference between the vacuum at that altitude versus the vacuum on the lunar surface?
Good question. Interesting point. Let's just explain how vacuum is measured. It's measured in a unit called TOR, T-O-R-R, named after an Italian scientist, Evangelista Torricelli, who developed the first workable barometer in the 17th century. So he was familiar with pressure, because that's what barometers measure, difference in pressure.
Yeah. So
it's measured in TOR. Now, at sea level, here on Earth, the TOR level is 760. Now, that is, anybody who's familiar with barometers and vacuum will know that that is the equivalent of millimeters of mercury in a barometer. So 760 torr is what happens at sea level. You get to the top of Mount Everest, which is 30,000 feet, 6 miles up, where jumbo jets fly if they're cruising between continents. Pressure there is about 150 torr. So it's considerably less. 150 torr. You go up another 50 miles to the edge of space, you're looking at torr 10 to the minus 3.
Okay, so what altitude, Marcus, would 10 to the minus 3 be roughly?
About 100 kilometers, 60 miles.
60 miles, so the Kármán line.
Kármán line, yes.
Yeah, okay.
International Space Station, say orbiting at 200 miles above the Earth's surface, pressure there would be about 10 to the minus 6, torr 10 to the minus 6. Because the further away from Earth you get, the less there is to press down. There are still particles of atmosphere which have drifted off, but it's the gravity of Earth which is holding most of it down. Yes, it can drift off. When you get to the moon, it's torr 10 to the minus 12. Several degrees higher than any pressure, certainly on Earth, but at the Kármán line, the International Space Station. So the further away from Earth you go, the harder the level of vacuum. And that is the key point. We all think of space as being basically the same, whether it's just above Earth or near the moon or near the sun or near Jupiter. No, it does vary because there are particles of atmosphere, i.e. matter, drifting off the Earth, which still affect any object there, but not by very much. I say torr 10 to the minus 12, that's 0.0 with 12 noughts after it, a very, very small fraction of what occurs even at the top of Mount Everest. So
now your experiment was equivalent to altitude you said was a Kármán line, about 62 miles.
Yeah.
And that was 10 to the minus 6?
No, 10 to the minus 6 would be at the space station.
Okay.
10 to the minus 3 would be at the Kármán line.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I got it. Yeah.
So obviously, the further away you get from Earth,
yeah,
the harder the vacuum becomes because there's less density to create any form of pressure.
Yeah.
So the vacuum chamber that Robert and Scott were using would have been equivalent to the Kármán line, i.e. the edge of space.
Yeah.
So as soon as you start getting close to that level, which is not very far away, 60 miles up, it's not very far away.
No.
Photographic film is affected adversely by the lack of pressure, i.e. by the vacuum. I mentioned outgassing as being one of the major effects of a vacuum. The other one is called cold welding. Now, cold welding, as the name implies, two metals come together, and if you apply on Earth, if you apply heat and melt those metals, they will combine and they will stick together. And that's what welding is. It's a very well-known science, a very well-known technology. And you see people going with their big goggles because when you start using electric arcs, the light is so intense it can damage the eyes, but it melts the metal. If you get into space, around 10 to the minus 6, you start getting the effects of cold welding. And just in the same way that liquids can have their lighter elements removed or ripped out by the vacuum, the same thing happens with metals. Metals contain all sorts of elements. Even though, say, it's aluminium, that will contain hydrogen. Hydrogen starts to be ripped out of the metal by the vacuum because nothing holding it in. And that hydrogen, helium, other lighter elements go looking for something to adhere to. And if they find another piece of metal similar, they will intermingle the molecules and they will basically weld together. It's cold welding. It's a well-known effect of vacuum on metal. So the question is, if you've got metals in your camera or on your spacecraft or on your lander, would those be cold welded at a certain point, or your spacesuit? If you put the helmet on your spacesuit, it's got a metal connector. So would that metal connector weld together? So you couldn't get the helmet off. Whoops, problem.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line from